Good morning. Good morning. This is the kind of performative element that's very challenging. I see nothing at all. I feel like a complete celebrity. I'm not. My name is Anne Gerritsen, and I'm very, very happy to welcome everyone here. Everyone in the audience, especially those of you who have never set foot in this auditorium before, because this is an amazing place, and this is a wonderful space to be doing this kind of activity in for this day. I'm also, of course, very pleased to see our old supporters and friends who are with us for many of the activities of the KVVAK and many of the activities that we have organized over the years. Also welcome, but it's especially nice for this to be a dynamic new group with new people, new members, and we hope that you enjoy today's activities. So, as I was walking here, I was thinking the worst thing that can happen to any field is, first of all, if people start to be very particular about the boundaries of that field, if they say, this field is this is what's included, and those things are excluded. Those things are not our field. That's a terrible thing. That's a sure sign of decline. So for it to be an open field is an excellent idea, and I hope you agree when you look at this program and when you hear today's speakers, you will realize this is an open field, and that's what makes it dynamic. The second thing that is terrible about any field is to have a field where basically everyone is my age. I'm over 50, well over 50, and if everyone is over 50 and no one is interested in joining, that's it. We're the end of it. That's decline. No one wants that. So to have a field in which there are BA students, MA students, PhD students, early career scholars, people in mid-career who've changed their career, if they want to be part of the conversation, if they want to contribute, if they want to say, these are things you should be doing differently, these are things that you are not thinking about, these are the things we want to bring to the table, then you have a strong field. So when we came up, and this is not the first time we have this Young Scholars Symposium, but when we sat around the table for this particular iteration of the Young Scholars Symposium, and we came up with our description and we sent out our call for papers, we had no idea we would have 135 applicants. And that is a sign that this is a very alive field, and that we here in the Netherlands, at the Rijksmuseum, in Leiden University, in the KVVAK, in the various organizations that are supporting this, we're doing something that is interesting and attractive, and we should make the most of it. And one of the things we can do is to celebrate all of that work, and that is what today is all about. So we are absolutely thrilled to be able to host this today, and I am very happy to be able to do that. I'm not even sure I said my name. Did I skip the fact that my name is Anne Gerritsen? I'm not sure. Maybe I said it, maybe. It's not important, because I've only done this as part of a team, an excellent team, a team of people who came from the KVVAK, from two other organizations that you will hear about in a moment. I won't steal their thunder, but also colleagues from Leiden University and from a number of museums who have offered their help and expertise in making the selection, in thinking through how this day could happen. So we're very pleased and very grateful to have all of those. There's three names that absolutely need mentioning. The first one is Rosalien van der Poel. Rosalien has done an amazing job, and we wouldn't be here without her. So a big thank you to Rosalien. Secondly, we wouldn't be here without the support of Thomas van Gulik, and you will hear from him in just a moment. The third person who made this possible, Pauline Kruseman, is not here with us today because we didn't manage to schedule this on a day that she could join us. She's busy elsewhere, but she is the one who made this financially possible as part of a larger group of supporters. And we're very sad she's not here, but very thankful for her to make this, to contribute to this day. That's my time, that's 5 minutes. I very much look forward to the day and I welcome you all here. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Denise Campbell, and this is Paul Ruitenbeek, and we just shortly want to introduce the Young Members Department of the KVVAK. This is called Ikigai, and it's been alive for around 10 years now, I think. And we have a group of people, a committee, myself, Paul, Senna van Dam, who is also presenting here today, and Laurens Kasteleins. And together we organize fun activities for people below 45 years of age, because we have to be realistic in our society. Membership for people under 30 is only 25 euros. So if you're not a member yet, one of the students here, please do so, because we always welcome young, fun people who are excited about Asian art. And finally, before I hand the microphone to Paul, just a little shout out to our former member, Eline van den Berg, who has been a member of Ikigai for a very long time and recently moved abroad. And she always was very enthusiastic about the Young Scholars Symposium and unfortunately couldn't be here today, so still in our hearts.
Yes, I'm Paul Ruitenbeek. I'm a dealer in Chinese art, and I joined the Ikigai committee around 5 years ago. As a team, we really try to involve the young generation in Asian art, and we try to organize events and get-togethers where young people really get the chance to handle objects, really get involved with the material. Also to let them know that there's not necessarily a big gap between them and a beautiful object, and especially when you provide the opportunity to handle a beautiful object, which we really stimulate. That helps enormously. Therefore, we organize events like a visit to an art fair, where the dealers who participate provide the opportunity to handle some of their objects or take us closer into their world. And also visits to galleries. For example, we started this year with a visit to the gallery of Dickie Zebrechts and Guus Roel, where we handled some weapons and netsuke, which was very, very interesting. Then after that, we went to TEFAF Maastricht, where we had a wonderful tour and handled beautiful objects and learned a lot. And for the later part of this year, we plan to pay a visit to Peter Dekker, who is a specialist in Asian arms and armor. And we also like to pay a visit to Roosmarijn van Beemen, who is a restorer in ceramics and glass, and will show us in her workshop how she works. And then finally, we will do our annual event, the tour at PAN, the fair in Amsterdam, where there's a very wide scope of Asian art dealers with various disciplines. So we're very much looking forward to that. And we also really invite everyone to sign up, also the children and grandchildren of existing members, everyone who's here, please sign up for Ikigai. And we hope to welcome you.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning. My name is Thomas van Gulik, and I'm here to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the Robert van Gulik family. And it is a great pleasure to do so, especially if I see so many young scholars here gathered in this symposium, which has really is very nice program for which I would like to congratulate you. And I think yeah, all of the more elderly share the view that the future of Asian studies, of course, lies in your hands, and we are very happy to help you in this journey from young to the more mature and hopefully established investigators in the end, with just facilitating and supporting this symposium. And I would like to acknowledge that from the beginning, this initiative has been supported by Jan Maarten Bol and Pauline Krugerman, who, as has been said, also helped us to support this meeting. The opportunity you have, I think, is quite unique to have a forum in which you can present your work in an international setting, and hopefully this will be the first step to a publication. And how important that is, I recently experienced with one of the works of my father, who at that time also started as a young scholar in Leiden and in Utrecht. And one of his last works was an essay, a monograph on the gibbon in China that was published in 1967 and described in quite some detail the lore of the gibbon, which is a monkey in China, as it was admired by many artists and was actually mentioned in literature and in poetry and in paintings depicted by many artists. And recently I was contacted by a primatologist center in Zurich who were specialized in the gibbon monkey. And they said that that book was so important because even it had been published more than 40 years ago, it still described the habitat of the gibbons 2,000 years ago, as it has been referenced and mentioned in literature, poetry, and in paintings. So that made them able to reconstruct the habitat of the gibbon in China, and they came to the conclusion that 99% has disappeared of that monkey. So that means that because of deforesting, of things like that, the animal couldn't survive. And so they called for attention to that fact, that they needed to be protected from further extinction, and so they directed the attention of the authorities in China that actually those gibbons should have the same status as pandas, because if nothing happens, then it will be completely extinct. So that shows how even after decades, your work can become so relevant and can suddenly become timely. So I hope this will encourage you to really write down your work and have it published so that it can have a public access and that will be permanent. So with these words, I wish you a very fruitful symposium, and I hope you will enjoy your discussions and company, especially in this wonderful location of the Rijksmuseum. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Willemijn van Noord. I'm the curator of the Chinese collections in the National Museum of World Cultures and the World Museum in Rotterdam. And I have the honor to present the first panel of speakers to you, the panel which is titled Porcelain. But if you've read the program, you'll see that's actually about much more than that. So porcelain or ceramics were most generally the material of which most Dutch collections of Asian art consist, or East Asian art, I should say. And they've had a profound impact on Dutch material culture as well, as testified by this tulip vase to my left. And so our first speaker, Joanna Ciemińska, will talk about the consumption of porcelain in the southern and northern Netherlands and challenging the long-held claim that Princess of Orange Amalia van Solms was the inventor of the porcelain cabinet. The last paper, Senna van Dam, will also touch upon this role that porcelain can play in the identity of a sort of a national culture when she talks about her presentation of the moon jar as a national symbol for Korea. Then we will also have a presentation about more the technical aspect of enameling of porcelain and how that's been so influential on the decorations on another material, namely Chinese enameled copper, in the presentation on her technical analysis by Meghan Parker. And Lecong Zhou will talk about not porcelain, but a different kind of Chinese ceramics that was very important in influencing a different type of imitation that was made here in Delft that's much less known than the tin glazed earthenware, namely Yixing stoneware that was used primarily for teapots. So I won't take too much of your time. You can read more about each speaker and their bios and their abstracts in the beautiful booklet that Rosaline has designed. And that's available at the front and also there, I guess. Yeah, so I will leave the stage in a minute, and the 4 speakers will come each after one another, and we will save questions for at the end of the 4 presentations. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Joanna Ciemińska.
Hello? Okay, you're here. Good morning. Thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to speak here. It's a real pleasure and honor to be able to open this symposium here in Rijksmuseum. And, I will open the symposium in Asian art with a lecture not precisely on Asian art, but about a lecture about the reception of Asian objects in historical interiors in Europe in the early 17th century and in the Low Countries specifically. Most of you probably have heard or even visited a so-called porcelain room. A porcelain room was usually a cabinet, a small room following the bedchamber, where large quantities of porcelain were displayed together to create a massed effect. They first appeared in the 16th century in Portugal and Spain, first European countries to acquire large numbers of Chinese porcelain. None of these rooms have been preserved, only archival documentation remains. In the early 17th century, the practice of setting up a porcelain room came to the Low Countries and was creatively developed and transformed to become around 1700, the height of fashion at European courts and palaces. Many of the late 17th century porcelain rooms were lost. Some have been reconstructed, and a few of them are still standing, like the porcelain room in Santos Palace in Lisbon, which is probably the oldest preserved such a room in Europe. With this presentation, I want to zoom into this particular moment in time when the first porcelain collectors and collections started to appear in the Low Countries in the early 1600s. I want to show how they were built up, by whom, and how they prepared the ground for the full-blown porcelain cabinets that we know of today. The Dutch started importing Chinese porcelain in the very first years of the 17th century, but it had to take a good couple of decades for the shift in porcelain consumption to become visible in Dutch households. Porcelain was still a rare commodity. For example, in Antwerp, in the first 4 decades of the century, the number of porcelain pieces owned by those of high or medium social standing would only exceptionally exceed 20 or 30. Nonetheless, porcelain consumption of the Portuguese inhabitants of Antwerp was different. The Portuguese merchants established in Antwerp in the late 15th century a royal trading post, making the city an international center for trade in non-European goods in the 16th century. Their inventories of goods show that they had similar patterns of porcelain consumption to their compatriots in Portugal. For example, a woman named Catarina Lopes, born into one of the wealthiest Portuguese families in Antwerp, had 130 34 pieces of porcelain recorded in 1615. This is a highly unusual number for Antwerp in the 1610s. She also owned an astounding amount of diamond, gold, and pearl jewelry, but however impressive this collection was, Katharina was not particularly keen on more moderately priced yet curious non-European collectibles such as lacquer, ivories, coconuts, and so on. A similar situation can be observed in the household of Katharina's uncle, Emmanuel Ciemińska, who had a separate room for the storage of porcelain in his town palace in Antwerp, recorded in 1617. It resembles Portuguese rooms with porcelain from the previous century called casinhas de porcelanas, which were small closets for the storage of expensive tableware, porcelain, maiolica, crystals, glassware, coconut cups, tortoise shell, and the like. Just like his niece, Ciemińska did not take any particular interest in exotic objects. His interest lay elsewhere. Regardless of his disinterest in the exotic, Ciemińska owned one of the largest collections of porcelain in Antwerp in the 1610s, probably only due to the Portuguese patterns of porcelain consumption, undoubtedly passed on to him by his older relatives. Another early porcelain room in the Low Countries also had an Iberian provenance. It belonged to Archduchess Isabella Clara Eugenia, daughter of Philip II of Spain. In 1599, she married her cousin Archduke Albert VII, former Viceroy of Portugal, and they ruled as governors of the Spanish Netherlands in the first 2 decades of the 17th century. Over the course of her life, Isabella received in gifts from her Spanish Habsburg relatives at least over 1,000 porcelain objects, which certainly makes her one of the most frequent receivers of porcelain gifts in Europe until then. Most of those gifts are recorded for the period of her governance in Brussels. Previously unpublished sources concerning the Koudenberg Palace in Brussels from 1610 revealed that Archduchess Isabella had a porcelain room on the 2nd floor of the residence above her bedchamber. Some renovations of the room were carried out under the supervision of Rodrigo Niño y Lasso, an unofficial first minister of the archdukes, who also had an interesting porcelain collection of his own. The early 17th century examples of porcelain rooms were of Iberian provenance. They were the first and short-lived type of porcelain room north of the Alps, and the missing link between, on the one hand, the Spanish and Portuguese rooms with porcelain, and on the other hand, Dutch porcelain cabinets, which came to fruition the second half of the 17th century. The porcelain cabinet was supposed to have appeared already full-blown in the 1640s at the court in The Hague of Amalia van Solms, Princess of Orange, as wife of Stadtholder Frederick Henry. However, there is yet another missing link between the two room types, that is, between the porcelain rooms of Iberian provenance and the fully blown Dutch porcelain cabinet. The antecedents of the porcelain cabinet should be looked for in the households of earlier princesses of Orange, that is, Eleonora of Bourbon-Condé and Louise de Coligny. They both set up private cabinets with a rich East Asian art display. They both belonged to the highest French aristocratic elite. Brother of Eleonora was for some time heir presumptive to the French throne. Her husband, Philip William, was son of William the Silent, and as a young boy was captured by the Duke of Alba and transferred to Spain, where he spent almost 30 years in relative seclusion. He returned to the Netherlands, this time to Brussels, as courtier of Archdukes Albert and Isabella. For a long time, they resided in Brussels, in the Nassau Town Palace close to the Koudenberg. You see both palaces highlighted in blue on the plan of Brussels. Philip William could take hold of his estates in the Low Countries only in 1610, and then moved with Eleonora to Breda Castle. However, they continued to frequently visit Brussels. It is safe to assume they saw the porcelain room of Archduchess Isabella and perhaps even porcelain collections of some of the Spanish courtiers in Brussels. Both Philip William and Eleonora kept an interesting collection of Asian objects in their private cabinets in Breda. However, Eleonora's collection exceeded her husband's in terms of number and interest. Her cabinet was adjacent to her bedroom, and its overall decoration was purposefully Asian. This Asian character was determined by East Asian golden wall hangings covering the walls and by a stark prevalence of Asian objects within the room contents. The cabinet was fitted with 5 major types of objects. Containers, such as coffers, boxes, and cabinets, most of them, that is 26, were described as Indian. 184 pieces of Chinese porcelain and 57 Asian lacquered objects, cups, saucers, bowls, boxes, but also a table. Other Asian objects such as 2 tablecloths and a mother-of-pearl casket. The cabinet's decoration was also complemented by European paintings and sculptures, mostly religious. And lastly, small items, usually made of silver and were hidden from view in chests and caskets. Objects which are clearly identified as Asian constituted 60% of the contents, whereas these that can be identified as European, only 13%. Even if we assume that the other 27% whose origin was uncertain were all European, a sound majority would still be non-European. What's equally important, Asian objects were the ones that were put on view and therefore determined the room's interior decoration. For these reasons, I propose that this room should be credited as an early example of East Asian room. It can be assumed that the blue and white cracked porcelain was the default variety of porcelain in the room, apart from the specifically mentioned set of 8 large white dishes, a cup on a gilded foot, and 7 gilded dishes. Porcelain was displayed alongside pieces of Spanish red earthenware, which was a pairing often found in Spanish porcelain rooms from around 1600. Unfortunately, we know nothing precise about the display, since there is no indication of porcelain and lacquer being put inside a coffer or a chest, as was the case with other precious objects of European origins, which was mentioned that they were put inside coffers and chests. There must have been on view, and since the lacquer table is recorded in the inventory just after porcelain and lacquerware, we can presume that these over 200 porcelain and lacquer objects were displayed together to create a massed effect on the table. Eleonora's cabinet was a multifunctional room. The preponderance of religious representations over secular ones suggests its devotional use, whereas an Indian coffer filled with linen cloth shows it also had a storage function. The cabinet was a French room type, and the first mention of this room within the House of Nassau appears at the court of Philip William and Eleonora, both in their palaces in Brussels and Breda. Because the cabinet was, as such, comes from France, the orange Nassau cabinets bear a particular resemblance to their French equivalents. For example, to the private cabinet of Catherine de' Medici from 1589, which also combined practical and everyday functions with those of a cabinet of art and curiosities. The early Dutch private cabinets, where porcelain and other Asian objects took the pride of place, inherited from their French predecessors their name and the combination of functions, that of display, storage, and everyday use. On the other hand, they inherited from Iberian porcelain rooms the concept of a massed porcelain display. Other cabinet with porcelain contemporary to the one of Eleonora belonged to Louise de Coligny, widow of William the Silent and mother of Stadtholder Frederick Henry. She had an apartment in the Oudehof in The Hague, which was composed of a bedchamber, a cabinet, a garderobe, and a painting gallery inspired by French examples. The room must have been large, which is suggested by the number of furnishings it contained. Like the cabinet of Eleonora, this one too was furnished with an array of cabinets and caskets, among which were 3 Asian ones, most likely lacquered namban pieces, fitted with many small drawers, gilded and inlaid with mother of pearl. They were accompanied by a lacquered lectern and 2 namban-type tables, and 2 upholstered armchairs, which suggests that the room was used as a living space. The cabinet was also used as an office, as there were 2 cabinets full of papers and letters. It was an intimate room where Louise de Coligny would reminisce about her relatives whose portraits hung on the walls. The chimney was crowned with Rubens' painting representing Queen Artemisia drinking the ashes of her husband, which referenced the widowhood of Louise de Coligny. Nevertheless, the pièce de résistance of the cabinet was the porcelain lacquer and earthenware display on 3 shelves placed one above each along the walls. They carried 285 pieces of porcelain, around 60 lacquer objects, around 90 of terra sigillata, 27 French earthenware pieces, pointing to the Coligny's origins. The shelves were composed of 6 ledges placed one above each. The largest pieces were placed on the top and the smallest on the bottom shelf, probably closest to the eye level, as the most distinctive pieces were placed there, that is on the bottom shelf. A rhinoceros cup, the lacquer wares, alabaster flower pots, a porcelain cup mounted in gilded silver, gilded porcelain pieces, and a group of enameled porcelain cups. That is, by the way, the first time that enameled porcelain appears in the Nassau inventories. On each shelf, there was almost the same number of pieces of the so-called terra sigillata, which also proves a deliberate artistic intention in arranging the display. The term terra sigillata refers to ancient Roman red gloss pottery, which you see in the middle of the slide. But it actually could be, maybe perhaps something different, because displaying blue and white porcelain with red ceramics of different origins, Asian, Mexican, Iberian, was very fashionable in the 16th and early 17th century. As I said, the objects were arranged on 3 shelves which most likely encircled the cabinet walls, and I believe might have formed a symmetrical composition with the chimney as the centerpiece. There are 3 reasons for why I think so. The first one is the sheer number of objects, almost 400, which makes the existence of a display on both sides of the room more logical. Secondly, the document mentions 88 objects placed beside the chimney on the 3 ledges of the shelf. This description points to the relevance of the chimney with the Rubens painting within the disposition of porcelain. It is therefore probable that the cabinet of Louise de Coligny was one of the first with a mass display of porcelain concentrated on the chimney breast, a design solution consecrated in the 1690s by the architect and interior designer Daniel Marot. Another detail which hints at the way porcelain was arranged in the cabinet of Louise de Coligny is the mention of a certain gilded screw found among the objects listed on one of the shelves, which, according to the inventory, served to hang porcelain dishes onto it. It suggests that some, if not all the dishes which were recorded as on the shelves were actually hung on the walls along the shelves or on the chimney breast. To swiftly recapitulate my analysis. So, first porcelain rooms in the Low Countries were the result of the transfer of Portuguese and Spanish patterns of porcelain collecting and displaying from the previous century. Portuguese porcelain rooms, casinhas de porcelanas, were brought to the Low Countries by the Portuguese merchants in Antwerp, whereas Archduchess Isabella and most likely her Spanish courtiers were responsible for bringing Spanish-type rooms with porcelain to Brussels. Brussels, in turn, was where the Nassau, that is Philip William, resided, and certainly got acquainted with courtly modes of art display. Apart from Iberian influences, there were also French ones, which Eleonora of Bourbon and Louise de Coligny are some to be credited for. One of the French cultural elements was the new room type, the cabinet, together with its customary modes of usage and display. I propose to consider both cabinets of Eleonora of Bourbon and Louise de Coligny as early examples of East Asian rooms. They have been regarded as a somewhat underdeveloped version of the real porcelain cabinet created in the 1640s by Amalia van Solms in Oudehof, of which, however, we know very little. Asian objects constituted from around 60 to 70% of this room's contents, therefore outnumber those of European or otherwise unknown origin taken together. In both cases, we see Asian lacquerware used to decorate a space predominantly fitted with porcelain. In the cabinet of Eleonora, it was an important part of the room's decoration, forming at least 13%. In the room of Louise de Coligny, lacquerware was placed on the shelves beside porcelain. Lacquer should be therefore recognized as a material associated with porcelain since the very beginning of Dutch collecting of Asian objects. The Princesses of Orange's deliberate will to create a space perceived as Asian or Indian is reflected not only by the mass display of porcelain, but also by the incorporation of Asian furniture, and in Eleonora's case, by using Asian wall hangings. Similarly to the Iberian porcelain rooms, her display of porcelain was interrelated with the display of European earthenware and red clay, most likely to create an interesting contrast of blue and white of porcelain with the redness of the clay. Thank you very much for your attention. I welcome more comments and questions.
So good morning. I'm Lecong Zhou, a research master student of art history at Utrecht University, and I just finished my internship in this beautiful museum. Today I'm going to present a shorter paper called a focus paper. So I'm going to talk a story about the purple sand and red earthenware, so basically the Yixing ware and its European imitations. So, yes, the story I'm going to talk is actually basically the story about the daily supply, a teapot. I will start with this IKEA teapot on my PowerPoint. And this teapot has the following descriptions on the IKEA website. Quote, "A beautiful sandy glazed surface turns every tea break into pure joy. This teapot comes with classic shape and a strong crafted look, a timeless feel with a unique design," unquote. Well, I cannot guarantee that this teapot will enhance your tea break experience. I must point out the striking resemblance in terms of general forms and components between the IKEA teapots and this early 18th century Delft earthenware teapots below it. It is easy to overlook the rich history behind such a commonplace item as a teapot. So the introduction of the teapot to Europe only dates back to the 17th century. The reason behind it is very straightforward. Tea, a drink that originated in China, was brought to Europe by the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century in significant amounts. The merchant ships of the East India Company brought not only tea, but also the utensils the Chinese use to drink tea, which is teapot. And if you ask a Chinese tea connoisseur about the best vessel for tea ceremony, that will be they will likely mention the word 紫砂 without any hesitation. So what is 紫砂? 紫砂 literally means purple sand. It refers to a type of clay produced around nowadays Yixing city, Jiangsu province in China. This clay is naturally rich in various metal elements. After being fired at high temperature in the kiln, pottery made from this in this special clay can develop colors ranging from orange to deep purple. Besides, this type of stoneware is relatively porous compared to glazed porcelain, while ensuring the water tightness. Therefore, the Chinese have considered it as an ideal tea drinking vessel already since the Ming Dynasty. As early as the late 17th century, Delft potters represented by Arie de Melder succeeded in imitating Yixing teapots with local materials. You can see his works in the middle. De Melder even applied for a patent for his product to the provincial government already in 1679. And in the application materials, De Melder proudly claimed that he has made earthenware teapots that are not inferior to any East India counterparts. Of course, East India here refers to China. His teapot became the standard of the red earthenware industry in Delft, flourished in the late 17th and early 18th century. In this mid-18th century painting depicting Dutch family life, we can see this cute, it doesn't work, this cute little red earthenware teapot right in the middle of the table. However, it's very difficult to tell whether the teapot in the painting is a Yixing product or the Delft copy. This is also the circumstantial evidence of the Delft earthenware industry's success, because you cannot really tell the differences, especially on the painting. Surprisingly, Delft's red earthenware teapot industry came to an abrupt end in the first half of the 18th century. Among the last generation of teapot makers, Jacobs de Calouet is considered a prominent figure. His teapot often have the trademark of the running deer, as I show at the corner of that picture. That's his trademark. And the teapot in the Museum Boijmans van Woninger's collection is really his typical style, with this rather large handle, short sprout, and this vertical and horizontal dotted lines. Those lines were believed to be applied by those rolling stamps. And de Calouet originally founded his workshop in Mooslang in Delft, in the downtown Delft, and then moved to the nearby Haashuislang after a fight with his previous neighbors. And he built up the second pottery workshop in on the Haashuislang. Following de Calouet's death, Delft lost its position at the center of producing red earthenware teapots in the West. This role was assumed by Mason in Germany and Staffordshire in England. Oh, go back. Yeah. So the Rijksmuseum collection includes teapots from not only Yixing but also European countries, including works by Arie de Melder, Jacobs de Calouet, Boutiger. Thus, the history of Yixing-style teapots spanning the East and the West should have been perfectly represented in the collection of this museum. However, 15 boxes of earthenware shards found in the Rijksmuseum's depot reminds us that this is too early to conclude. These 175 fragments or shards come from an archaeological exhibition in the 1970s. The exhibition was not seriously documented, which is a shame. The only surviving records show that the exhibition took place in the back garden of a family lived in the Haashuislang in Delft, the very street where de Calouet established his second studio. Many shards in this collection bear the trademark of a running deer, the trademark of de Calouet's workshop. Apart from this, no other marks were found. This is exciting to witness how these fragments are changing our understanding of de Calouet's creation and the red earthenware industry in Delft in general. These works have introduced new levels of innovation regarding the glaze color. You see this beautiful abstract bronze things under the transparent yellow glaze, could be imitating the tortoise shell or inspired by certain glaze from the East. But also the shape, for example, this jug, the coffee or milk jug, those things are never have been seen before. And our previous perception of de Calouet as merely the faithful successor of and follower of de Melder has been challenged. From this collection, one may trace the source of inspiration, courage of innovation, and even the decline, or the reason behind the decline of Delft red earthenware industry in the early 18th century. However, I wouldn't be able to extend these topics in my presentation due to the time constraints. But today, I would like to invite you to think about a question that is more broad and abstract. So why are there such big differences between these shards and de Calouet's works in most of the museum's collection? In other words, what are the differences between excavated materials and works handed down through generations? You see this picture. This is the picture I took from the depot of the Rijksmuseum with all the archaeological materials, 175 shards. And this, if you search de Calouet in Rijksstudio, this is what you will find. And most of the museum will give you this image, the traditional de Calouet pieces, the style we are most familiar with. So in my view, the unique value and charm of archaeological excavation lie in its ability to transform the ancient into the modern at the very moment the underground material is unearthed. In the case of my research, when the Lucky exhibition team dug up these shards from the garden of on the Haushauslang in 1970s, the material remains from the colorways era traveled immediately and directly to the 20th century, like in a time capsule. On the contrary, those colorways work that have been handed down from generation to generation have undergone layers of social selection and market filtering, and also taste, our previous scholarships, etc., from the time they were produced to the present. How accurately do these materials depict the colorways' accomplishments? In the traditional writing of the Western ceramic history, the colorway is considered the end of Delft's great red earthenware industry. And this shard in the collection of Rijksmuseum helped to change our view and draw a complete picture of the colorway and his achievements. He may not be a melancholy swan song of red earthenware teapot tradition imitating Yixing originals, but the dawn of the new era featured by the Delft tin glaze earthenware before the 19th century. And before the end of my presentation, I'm going to do this little advertisement. So I invite you to check the display of Yixing wares and its European imitations that will be exhibited this October in the Asian Pavilion in this very museum, not very far from us. And after viewing this splendid history of the red earthenware teapots in the context of early modern culture and the material exchange between the East and West, you may look at the IKEA teapot in a completely different way when you go back to your home. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Meghan Parker, and I'm a metal conservator in training at the University of Amsterdam. Well, while I know I'm here presenting during the porcelain session, I'm actually going to be talking to you today about a set of objects that, while connected to porcelain, are not actually porcelain. As a further caveat, I will be discussing this collection from a conservator's perspective. This means the focus is on the material properties of the objects, and the objective, protecting and preserving these properties for future generations. Amidst the Rijksmuseum's multitude of objects lies a small collection of colorful porcelain-like enameled metalware. These brightly shining, whimsical pieces, manufactured in Canton, modern-day Guangzhou, are emblematic of the long 18th century, that time of fascinated emulation and exchange between China and Europe. This project originated with a question: should Chinese painted enamels be treated and conserved in the same manner as European painted enamels? While many of the Rijksmuseum's European painted enamels have already been subject to extensive research, the Chinese painted enamels have received far less attention. Since so little work has been done on this collection, answering such a question first requires characterizing the Chinese painted enamels themselves. Namely, what was used to make them and how. Now, historical and secondary sources were able to provide some of this information. Much, however, was left unrecorded. Thus, the objects themselves become the most important witnesses. Tools used to give them a voice included microscopy and non-invasive analytical techniques such as X-ray fluorescence and X-radiography. During this presentation, I will briefly discuss the historical context and technological developments of Chinese painted enamels. I will then introduce the case study objects and present some of the key insights they were able to give us about their materials and manufacture. We throw around the term enamel indiscriminately these days. Historically, however, the term was far narrower. A low melting point glass flux that fuses through heating to metal, ceramic, or glass substrates. The focus today is on enamel applied to metal substrates. Enameling is an ancient technology, with small enameled gold objects found as early as 1500 BCE. Painted enameling, however, was a much later innovation that developed in the mid-15th century CE. From this initial foray, two main schools developed: Limoges school painted enamels and later overglaze enamel painting techniques. The precursors of painted enameling were the goldsmith techniques, cloisonné, champlevé, and bosse-taille. These earlier enameling methods used enamel as an inlay, filling depressions carved into the substrate or designs laid out in thin metal wires, or to encrust surfaces and add color. Painted enamel, on the other hand, consists of decorative enamel layers applied to a smooth, pre-fired ground enamel, unconstrained by metal outlines. Painted enameling first flourished in the French city of Limoges. There, a unique technique developed. Limoges painted enamels employed layers of translucent enamel laid over clear or opaque grounding layers to build depth and dimensionality. The Limoges school was the dominant approach to painted enameling from the late 15th to early 17th centuries. The mid-17th century, however, saw the development of another form of painted enamel, often called overglaze or miniature enamel painting. This type of painted enamel used more traditional painting techniques. To produce these enamels, the metal substrate was first covered in a uniform layer of opaque white enamel. This surface was fired, then smoothed and polished, after which enamel colors mixed with oil were applied with fine brushes and fired again to create small, exquisite paintings in glass. Unlike Limoges enamels, overglaze techniques did not scale up well. Larger pieces, more than 10 centimeters, often fired with significant flaws and substrate deformation, which, due to the delicacy of the painted enamel layers, were uncorrectable. Workshops that used overglaze techniques for larger formats had to adapt them in various ways. The two remaining Limoges enameling families at this time, Ladon and Noyer, skirted some of these problems by combining overglaze techniques with older Limoges working methods. Other workshops, such as Henry Bones in England, successfully applied knowledge acquired from working with glass and porcelain overglazes. Finding solutions to these scaling problems was also a very important part of the technological development of Chinese painted enamels. Sometime in 1728, Philip Dormer Stanhope, the 4th Earl of Chesterfield, received an enthusiastic letter from Henrietta Howard, the Countess of Suffolk. "I have bought some china here, which was brought by the last East India ships that came in, of a very particular sort. Its greatest merit is being entirely new. They are metal, enameled inside and out with china of all colors. The development of this new china of all colors can be attributed to a confluence of events: ambitious French Jesuit missionaries, the Kangxi Emperor's global aspirations, the lifting of a ban on overseas trading with Europe, and Chinese expertise in cloisonné and porcelain decoration. Imperial interest in painted enamels is thought to have been partially set in motion with the 1688 gift of 2 enamel portrait miniatures in copper from Louis XIV to the Kangxi Emperor. The Kangxi Emperor's interest in enamelware soon became well known in Europe, and enamels began to be featured prominently in diplomatic gifts to the court. The Kangxi Emperor's ambitions, however, extended far beyond passively accepting enamel gifts. In keeping with his desire to promote and further develop Chinese goods, he was determined to produce equally refined objects domestically as well. But a clear origin story for Chinese painted enamels remains somewhat obscure. This is partly due to a lack of concrete documentation and to conflicting Chinese and European accounts. The technological contributions from European sources, such as continental European glassmaking and enameling traditions and Venetian glassmaking knowledge, are important. However, Chinese porcelain production and the existing Chinese cloisonné enamel workshops also form an equally important part of this story. Imported European enamels on metal became prestigious models for Chinese development of large format enameled objects. This goal fitted with the imperial workshop system the emperor had established in 1680. From missionary accounts, the first painted enamel experiments seem to have taken place in Beijing in 1714, with a dedicated workshop for enameling on porcelain and metal established in 1716. Correspondence over the next 40 years attests to the emperor's demands for skilled European enamelers, glassmakers, and for raw materials. Since large format painted enamels had fallen out of fashion in Europe, it was difficult to find European enamelers able to demonstrate these techniques, and the imperial workshops had to partially reinvent the process themselves, employing artisans skilled in making cloisonné and enameled porcelain. The port city The port city of Guangzhou, however, became the main center for the development and production of painted enamels. Guangzhou's role as a trading emporium with continuous exposure to foreign goods and people may have led to the development of a less elaborate version of painted enamel even before Beijing. Approaches to painted enamel production continued to develop and improve under the auspices of the Yongzheng Emperor, who promoted the use of domestically manufactured colors for their production. The end of the Yongzheng period and the early portion of the Qianlong Emperor's reign are typically considered the apex of painted enamels on copper in terms of sophistication and complexity. After Imperial Enameling Workshop in Beijing began to see a gradual decline, finally shuttering in 1789. Guangzhou, however, continued to produce and export painted enamels on copper well into the 19th century. The Rijksmuseum's collection currently holds 24 Guangzhou-made Chinese painted enamels, dated between 1700 and 1800. 8 of these 24 Chinese painted enamels were selected for technical analysis. A late 18th century Limoges painted enamel plaquette was also analyzed to compare basic material differences. Objects were selected based on several criteria intended to provide a broad picture of the collection. Criteria considered were history and length of time in the collection, quality and complexity of decoration and manufacture, and current condition. The objects selected, listed in order of earliest to latest accession date, are an 18th century Limoges copper plaquette with an image of the Annunciation, a painted enamel plaque of figures in a pavilion, a staff decorated with figures and runes, a square tray with flowers and pheasants, and a large oval tray on 4 legs with recessed corners decorated with flowers, a workshop pattern tile, 2 square saucers with scenes of Dutch merchants, and a kettle with a stand and oil reservoir. Many Chinese painted enamels were also produced in multiples, and several analogs of the Rijksmuseum's objects exist in other collections, providing opportunities for material and condition comparisons. These include analogs of the runic staff and the workshop pattern tile at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and analogs of the runic staff and the kettle set at the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Painted enamels are constructed in layers. All the case study objects shared a similar layered construction, consisting of a group of specific elements: a metal substrate, ground enamels, decorative overglaze enamels, black outlining, and unfired or fired gilding. At a painted enamel's core is a copper substrate sandwiched between opaque ground enamel and counter enamel. Over these ground layers, overglaze enamel decorations were applied, typically consisting of a thin underdrawing and a variety of overglaze colors. To emphasize the design and add accents, black outlining and painted gilding were applied last. Making a Chinese painted enamel starts with constructing its underlying metal body. XRF analyses of accessible metal substrate areas show they were made from relatively unalloyed copper. This includes the Limoges plaquette substrate. The relative purity of the copper used for the Chinese painted enamels points to Japanese imported copper, a common source of copper in China during the 18th century. These metal substrates are also quite thin. An exposed corner of the workshop pattern substrate layer measured approximately 0.9 millimeters thick. This would have allowed, for instance, the use of press molds for shaping, a faster and less skilled technique than raising with a hammer. 2 of the more complex case study objects, the large tray and the kettle, were also X-rayed. The resulting images showed an interesting phenomenon. Neither the kettle nor the tray appeared to have any mechanical joins. A metalworker has some choices when fabricating a complex piece. Components can be joined mechanically, or by brazing and soldering. Historically, European enamelers avoided braze seams because of their tendency to soften and deform during the enamel firing process. Instead, wire, tabs, and strips were used for assembling, visible here in the X-ray of a V&A Limoges enamel ewer. Out of the 8 Chinese case study objects, however, 6 of them appear to have only used brazing techniques. This practice could be related to enamel composition. Higher levels of lead present in Chinese enamels may have reduced the required firing times and temperature. Less heat and firing time means less chance for a braze seam to open or deform. Surrounding the metal substrate is a thick coat of glass enamel. This was applied to all sides of the metal to prevent deformation during firing. Ground enamel could be applied in several ways: as a paste mixed with water, or for more complex shapes, pounced dry over an adhesive-coated metal form. Another approach was to apply the ground as a slip, dipping or spraying the enamel onto the copper body. This may have been adopted in China for painted enamel production, since it was a method already used in the production of ceramics. And some of the case study objects do have traces of enamel in unlikely crevices. Analyses of the ground layers of the Chinese enamels show they all appear to contain lead, arsenic, and trace amounts of potassium. This corresponds to existing Chinese glass technology, a lead flux opacified using arsenic oxide, with potassium promoting fusibility and fluidity. In comparison, the presence of lead and tin in the Limoges plaquettes white ground is characteristic of French and German opaque white enamel compositions. To apply designs, overglazed enamel colors mixed with oil or water were painted over the fired ground enamel. Pieces with complex designs were fired many times to build up the multiple decorative layers, starting with the highest temperature colors. A variety of overglazed colors can be seen on the case study objects, leading to different decorative effects. Micro-XRF analysis of a bright yellow on the large tray showed the presence of lead and tin, while analysis of a rose pink found gold but no tin. These elemental compositions suggest a link to lead tin yellows and tin-free colloidal gold rose pinks found respectively in Chinese cloisonné and enameled porcelain. Every time you fire an enamel, you increase the risk of surface defects. The most common of these are stretch marks, lines where the painted enamel layer has split, exposing the white ground underneath. These are present on all the case study objects except the Limoges plaquette. Stretch marks on one of the most elaborately painted case study objects was hatched over with a black enamel, which XRF analysis of this enamel layer suggests links to outline compositions given both in 18th century European enameling manuals and black outline colors used on Chinese enameled porcelain. Gilding was the final stage in the production of a painted enamel. Metal rims and feet and the enamel surface were all frequently gilded. While China has a long tradition of mercury gilding, other gilding techniques were employed as well. Chinese gilding can be divided into fired and unfired techniques. Both were used on metal and enameled surfaces. Unfired gilding techniques include applying gold leaf or powdered gold, either over or mixed with adhesives. An example of unfired leaf gilding is visible here on the kettle's metal handle. Fired gilding approaches included mercury gilding and some alternate techniques developed by the porcelain industry. XRF analysis of gilding on the framed plaque, on the two square saucers, and on the Limoges plaquette suggests different techniques were used for each. The framed plaque appears to have been mercury gilded, while the saucer's gilding may be based on a porcelain industry recipe, such as the gold, white lead, and gummed water described by Danterkohl's letters on porcelain production. In conclusion, the technology employed to make Chinese painted enamels is very complex. In many ways, the case study objects resembled European painted enamels. Stratigraphy, substrate composition and thickness, and use of painted gilding for finishing all appeared to be broadly alike. This suggests that Chinese painted enamels can be physically conserved similarly to European enamels. But there are also significant differences. Rather than complex mechanical joins, the copper bodies of the Rijksmuseum's Chinese painted enamels are mostly braced together. Ground enamel compositions differ. Significant amounts of arsenic are found in all the Chinese enamel grounds analyzed rather than the tin used in European grounds. The elemental compositions of the bright yellow and rose pink analyzed on the large tray also indicates connections to Chinese cloisonné and polychrome enameled porcelain. Since it was only possible to perform limited analyses on a limited selection of painted enamels, however, these results serve largely as invitations for future research. Using XRF or SEM-EDX analyses to build a material database of Chinese painted enamel compositions, for example, could help to further unravel the technological and material development of these objects. I would like to thank Tamar de Wiedewitz for her supervision of this project, Luc Megens for his help with the XRF analyses, Ari Papot for the X-rays, Qingling Wang and Jan van Kampen for feedback and access to the objects, and all the members of the Rijksmuseum's Metal Conservation Department for their support. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Sanel van Dam. I'm here to talk about the moon jar, or to introduce the moon jar to you. And I'm very excited to be here, so let's get started. During the opening ceremony of the 2018 Olympic Games in South Korea, the moon jar was used as a cauldron to light the Olympic fire, as you can see by looking at this image. The Olympic Games, which I believe everybody here is familiar with, provide the hosting country with an amazing opportunity to showcase their heritage and cultural identity. And the selection of the moon jar as a cauldron, therefore, cannot be seen as unintentional or accidental. And this this really underlines its function as a national symbol of the country. But before I tell you more about the origins of the moon jar, I wanted to take a quick moment to tell you that Korea has a very rich ceramic history. And on the occasion of being in the Rijksmuseum today, I wanted to show you some of the amazing objects that are in the collection of the Rijksmuseum, ranging from 5th century stoneware pieces to 18th century stoneware pieces. And if you haven't already, I urge you to take a quick look or inspect them closely, these Joseon Dynasty wares on the right side of the screen in the Asian Pavilion, since they are on display right now. So now let's get back to the moon jar. The moon jar was first produced during the late 17th century in the government-run kilns located in Gwangju, in Gyeonggi province, which is near modern-day Seoul. They were produced in the government-run kilns that produced wares for use at court and the government offices. As you can see by looking at the image, you can see a clear connecting line at the middle of the jar, and this is the result of the production method used to produce this jar. Because of its size, this particular vessel being 46 centimeters in height, the jar could not be potted in one time, so they were made in two separate halves, which were later connected at the rim before they were glazed and put in the kiln. And this allowed for a very large jar to emerge from the kiln, which was used as a storage jar for liquid types of foods, such as sauces, fermented foods, but also alcohol at the royal court and at the government offices. I want to argue that the moon jar has emerged out of practicality, besides being very aesthetically pleasing to the eye. As the late 17th century followed a period in Korean history which posed great difficulty for the Korean nation, the Joseon dynasty at the time. Since in the late 16th century, the country had been invaded by Japan several times, and during the early 17th century, the country had been invaded by the Manchus, which left many kilns devastated and exhausted the country of raw materials used for the production of ceramics. And this particular vessel was made without wasting many precious materials and still allowing for a very utilitarian object to emerge from the kiln. As you can see, the body is left undecorated, and this is said to reflect the Neo-Confucian ideals. Neo-Confucianism being the state doctrine of the Joseon dynasty, which underpinned all aspects of Korean society. And the undecorated surface is said to reflect the purity and frugality, which was an effect of the Neo-Confucian values. Then during the early 20th century, during the colonial period of Korea, Korean art was re-evaluated by the new colonial government. And the Joseon ceramics, and like the moon jar, was actually not much appreciated during this time. This changed with publications of Japanese scholar and collector Yanagi Muneyoshi, who grew very fond of the Joseon dynasty white wares, like the moon jar, and advocated for their aesthetic qualities. However, his perception of these wares was not free from a colonial narrative, as he noted that the Joseon porcelain embodied a beauty of sorrow, and he called it artless art, and said that the aesthetics reflected Korea as a defeated nation. And he saw that the absence of color were emblematic of this notion of his. Then, following the liberation of colonial rule, the need was felt to formulate a new Korean identity that was free from this colonial narrative. And many Korean scholars and artists, like artist Kim Hwang-ki and scholar Choi Sunu, were very critical of this approach of Yanagi to the Joseon ceramics. Instead of the moon jar being emblematic of the sadness of the Korean people, artists Kim Hwang-ki and Choi Sunu argued that the moon jar evoked warmth of the Korean people and the happiness of the Korean people. And especially Kim Hwang-ki, whose painting you can see on the slide. As you can see, he was very much inspired by the moon jar. He was also credited with coining the term moon jar, which became used from the 1940s, and especially through museum practices. The Korean government found that through cultural diplomacy, this new notion of the Korean identity free from colonial influences could be brought. It's working again. Through cultural diplomacy and through the displays of this moon jar, which greatly embodies the Korean aesthetics and the essence of Koreanness in the eyes of Kim Hwang-ki and Choi Sunu, the moon jar would show the distinctive Korean aesthetic, free from the colonial interpretation of it, in museums today. And as you can see on the slide, the moon jar has become a very popular object to be featured in exhibitions on Korean art, also in the Netherlands, in the Prinsessenhof a few years ago. And through these museum practices, the moon jar has been highlighted as a symbol of Korean culture, especially because of its natural forms and that it embodied the Neo-Confucian ideals of the society at the time of its production. And it has been greatly highlighted through these exhibitions as a symbol of Korean identity. So that's my talk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you to all the speakers for really fascinating talks that have really brought some new perspectives to Asian art, but also thank you for keeping to your time limits really well, so we have ample time for questions before the coffee break. So I would like to invite questions from the room for our four speakers. So if you have a question, please say for who the question is. Ja? En deze geef je dan rond? Ja, oké. Do we have any questions for our speakers? I think people are a bit shy to start. Oh ja, Jan van Kampen.
Is die aan? Nee. Ja? Oh.
Dank. I have a question for you, for my neighbor.
Oh, maybe you could stand up. Yeah.
It was a fascinating talk, and I'm very much interested in the subject. And I was wondering whether you could say something about the function of the ceramics, because when I was reading about it a little bit, I thought that banquets in the Iberian world were rather common, banquets with porcelain, and that it is something that I can't find any traces of in the north. So, what's your view on that?
You have your sender.
I have already. Okay. Well, I definitely have seen mentions of usage of porcelain as tableware during very lavish banquets in Portugal. That's for sure. In the 16th century, well, there were mostly connected to the Braganza court. So the Braganza was like only the second to the king, so like the first aristocratic family in Portugal. So definitely, and with strong connections to the overseas, to India. But for Spain, for the 16th century, I don't think I have encountered, especially when it comes to the Habsburg court. In Spain, you have, for example, in inventories, porcelain is recorded in the recámara, together with lacquerware, with rich caskets, such as that would be kept rather close to somewhere to the bedchamber. And I would say that probably porcelain would be used in everyday use, but not as tableware. But for example, to wash hands, to do some toilet in the morning or whatever. It's not, we haven't got any clear sources that would indicate that, but I would suppose that they could be used sporadically, probably maybe in everyday use, and also would be considered as art pieces worthy of displaying, probably. Because when they were recorded in the recámara with all sorts of luxurious objects that we would consider art pieces today. So, which obviously at the time could have practical function. There was not a clear boundary between usage and the showing off your taste, your wealth, etc. So it was connected, but. So this is Spain and Portugal and porcelain, yes. And for example, in Italy, in the Medici court, porcelain is recorded as being used mainly for, there was this type of furnishing called credenza. So this was like a display buffet, standing beside the table. So not exactly used as tableware. Silver was used as tableware, but porcelain is recorded as being used specifically for the credenza. So to display maybe some fruits on the table and to display the vessel itself. So yes, this is what I can tell. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry, I should have invited all the speakers to come to the front, so if you could all come and stand here to take the questions. Thank you. No further. Yeah. Oh yeah, Anne. Anne Gerritsen.
I can shout. Oh, but for the listeners online, maybe they don't hear you.
Okay. Or I can repeat.
Oh yeah. My question is for Meghan. What are the main sources of risk or damage that you have to deal with?
So the question is about for Meghan what the risks are for damage in these enamel copperwares.
So actually, what sort of started this is that Limoges painted enamel actually has a lot of issues with what they call glass sickness. So there's a lot of issues with chemical instability of the glass, and they will basically start cracking, and the picture is completely destroyed. And so there were some thoughts like, oh, well, it might be interesting to look into painted enamels and see if this is also an issue, if they also have these problems. Because if they do, then they're very specific storage and atmospheric conditions they have to be kept under, and they have to be monitored, and it's just like that. They're very, very fragile. Thankfully, we didn't find any instances of unstable glass, and in the literature reading I did, it didn't seem like any other conservators working with these collections found that. So I think it's a testimony to the expertise of Chinese glassmakers that they weren't having these issues with this glass instability. But the objects are also very fragile physically, because it's this very thin layer of copper, and then it's this very rigid glass over the copper, and so any kind of mechanical distortions will cause cracking, and if you have enough cracking, the glass will actually come off. And they have these issues with these like small snuff boxes that have maybe been dropped or just mishandled or been slightly deformed, and the enamel is under such compressive force to sort of stay on the surface that once you start cracking it, it can actually start like springing off. They've had cases where you'll see this glass and it will go flying across the room on these little objects. So there hasn't been the same issues with the Chinese enamel so much. I think it's spread out a little bit more, but we do have issues where the glass will actually come off. They also, there's a lot of issues with like dirt getting into cracks, and so, yeah.
Yeah, very challenging.
I've got a question. Oh, does this work? Yeah. I have a question for Jason. So of course, Yixing teapots in China, of course, is very associated with this shift in tea drinking practices at the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, this shift to leaf tea, infusions, typically very high tea to water ratios. I was wondering if you could maybe tell a bit more about how these Yixing copies were used in the Netherlands or in Europe.
So today, my presentation is about the Yixing ware imitated in Delft in a specific time period. That is the late 17th century and early 18th century. So it's rather early period of this tradition in Europe. And back to them, especially in the Netherlands, they use it mainly for tea vessels. They literally use those pots to drink tea, and some Delft pots has a layer of tea residues inside the pots, so they drink, they literally use them. And in several occasions, we also find those tea trays as a little plate, but if you examine the size and also the depth and design of that tray, is probably used for tea. It's like a teapot stand or something like that. So you put that tray below the teapots. So I think back to that period, this is still the material that linked to tea drinking culture. But like what I said, after Jacobus de Calouet, so precisely after 1730s, this tradition sort of disappeared in Netherlands. Jacobus de Calouet was one of the last people to make this pot, and if you examine his pot, it's already far. It's not really red earthenware anymore. There are all kinds of glaze. It's more like a tin glazed Delftware. So when German and English people sort of took over this tradition, they use this material for multiple purposes, including flower vases and some European shapes. In that period, this is really just the artistic material rather than something related to or exclusively related to tea.
Hi, Sana, I have a question for you. I'm actually curious, why is it called a moon jar? Just because of its shape and color, or are there any other reasons?
No, you're completely right. Yeah, because of its shape and because of its color, and it also shows some asymmetrical forms and some discolorations which make it reminiscent of the moon. So that's why it's referred to as a moon jar, yeah.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, does the white, does the color white have a symbolical meaning for these vessels? Or
yes, it's often said that the whiteness of the jar reflects the Neo-Confucian ideals that were present in the Korean society at the time. So white porcelain was actually first used at the Korean court from the 15th century, the second half of the 15th century, and it was actually used to perform Neo-Confucian rites at court. So white porcelain had been used for that purpose before the production of the moon jar. So, yes.
I have a question for Jason too. I like how towards the end of your talk you make this comparison between shards that have been recently unearthed and are transported straight into the modern period, and versus teapots that have been handed down for generations and have these stories and layers of discourse attached to them. I wanted to ask, I'm assuming that shards too will have layers of discourse attached to them, even though they are transported straight into the modern time, as you agree. What are some of these discourses, do you think? How have you identified them? Are you taking them into your research as well?
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully understand your question, but yes, when I do my research, I'm at the dilemma that is a lot of shards have never been seen in museum collections. Museum collection, I mean the works handed down through generations, so circulated in the society. And before we do the research on this shard collection directly excavated from or highly possibly from the Callaway's second workshop, we never know Callaway ever produced this type of ceramics. You cannot compare these shards with any existing works. And several shards is even rare in the scenario of Delft ware in general. It's astonishing. So one of my biggest research question is why these shards end up as a shards, why they were buried together. By whom? By Callaway himself, or by somebody else, or it is his experimental pieces, so it's or not well accepted by the society. So that's why I just touch upon this issue very briefly today because of my time limit. I have a feeling that the reason of the differences lies in the social selection and the marketing, the market reaction, because Ari de Mulder set a very high standard, basically define what is Delft-made red earthenware in the 17th century. So on the one hand, it gives you a role model to follow. On the other hand, it's not good for his followers to make innovations. And as I said, the Callaway was considered as a complete failure in the traditional ceramic writing and scholarship. But if you see the pots I present today, those are very avant-garde back to the 17th century. And in terms of shard issue, ceramic is extremely durable. That's why you can find shards. Just think about painting. If it break down, or if it has been burned, for example, they burn it down to the ashes, you cannot find any residues. While ceramics, even you break it, you can still find the shards. Meanwhile, ceramic was made from clay, so it's a very invaluable material. So it's not like a silverware, so you can melt it down and the value is still here, the value resides on the material itself. But in terms of ceramics, once you break it apart, normally you just abandon it. That's why you can find shards, while it's quite rare in other art genre. Yeah.
As a follow-up, I'm just curious, have you been in touch with archaeologists? Like maybe in like the depots of archaeology in Delft, there are
it was conducted by the commercial archaeological company, so not very well documented. And only one people still alive, I mean, from that exhibition team, and he only have the vague memory about the location and the situation. And so far, I found 0 photos, 0 documents, and I don't think they exist. So it's quite a shame.
A question for Joanna. Joanna, could you say a little bit more on this aspect of ostentatious gift giving on the one hand, and ostentatious accumulation of things in your possession on the other hand? It would seem to be a matter of, to what extent would it seem to be a matter of corroborating your relations with your family and with your friends in terms of precious gifts, which you then accumulate in a very visible way? You allude to that in your bio, but not in your talk. In your biography.
Okay, yeah. Yes, well, there is a very well-documented practice of gift giving from, let's say, the middle of the 16th century to basically the 18th century, but I've looked into like from 16th to early 17th century. Gifts coming from Spain and Portugal to Central Europe and also to the Low Countries. Which is interesting because, as you say, ostentatious, which is true, but at the same time we should also keep in mind that, because we're talking here in the specific case about the Habsburgs, so they were like a family, so they would exchange gifts. Which did not always have to be like to have the function of ostentatious gifts, but just, for example, to maintain relations. Because we have a lot of maybe it's maybe not very well acknowledged that, for example, the most frequent gift giver from the Habsburgs from Madrid to Europe was Maria of Austria, who herself was not really an art collector, but she would send gifts all the time to her family members, just probably, I would assume, in a way to keep in touch. But also, obviously, she would send gifts to different gifts to different people. So, for example, her son Rudolf, the Emperor Rudolf, would receive the most interesting, most ostentatious gifts, whereas her other children, she had 8 children, and they were like receiving different types of gifts based on their status, on their sex. Also, women would receive different gifts, etc.
To say that to some extent the collection was not intended as such, but it was a side effect of people keeping up their relationships.
What was the side effect? Yes, yes. Gift giving was one of the main ways, one of the most obvious ways that collections would be formed since always, I think. So, yes, definitely. Yes.
Well, so I'm curious about that because I was just thinking about, for example, in China, where there was this sort of preference for receiving certain kinds of gifts. Would that also then affect? Someone would be maybe known for like, oh, I really like collecting porcelain, and so then that's the sort of gifts that they're getting given. So is it sort of that?
So the person would prefer to receive some type of gifts than others, and then yes, you could trace it because actually it's really interesting that we have this corpus of sources that is really well preserved when it comes to this exchange. And we can really do like, I am doing a quantitative analysis on this type of like who received which type of things the most, like, so, yeah, and it's interesting on the topic of porcelain, that porcelain was like the most frequent gift of all, I think, in the 16th century globally. I mean, when it comes to these non-European objects. Yes. And the Archduchess Isabella, actually, she was, I think, in the top because there was like one gift where she received 600 pieces from Philip III, I think. So she definitely had to have a space to put it into.
Thank you so much for a very insightful and interesting presentation. I have a question about the moon jar, Joanna van Dam, and that's specifically about the article from last year from Charlotte Hollick on moon jar and the making of Korean icon. And then just basically, how's your approach? How do you relate to that? And what is your take on the moon jar? How is it different? And
A very good question. Well, for today, I only had 8 minutes to talk about the moon jar. So, as you might have noticed, I have taken a lot of inspiration from her article. So today I just decided to tell you some of the interpretations of the moon jar and how I relate to that. Well, the article was, of course, quite limited to how the moon jar has been approached in Britain and in British museums. So for me, I think it would be very interesting to look more at how the moon jar is received in different countries as well. But I did really enjoy her approach, I guess, because of the different interpretations to the moon jar she highlighted very much. So that's kind of what I tried to do today a little bit. I'm not sure about your question, but I think that, yeah, it's very interesting to see the difference in what the moon jar emerged from, which is also in part for practicality, and because the the materials were limited for its production. I think that is something that is not highlighted as much as the modern approach to how it embodies Korean society as a whole, because it's of course made in a very specific time period. So I would say that it mostly reflects that part of Korean history, while there are lots of other very interesting objects from Korean ceramics that tell a very different story about the general history of Korea. So.
Time for one last question. Ness in the back. No? Oh, just a wave? Okay. There's it.
I have a question for Meghan. The people who painted the artwork on the ceramics, at the time, were they considered real artists? Were they in high esteem? Because it's very beautiful, of course, what they painted. How were they looked at?
I'm not completely sure. I think to some degree that you didn't really see any sign. You didn't see people signing their work, for instance. But I know that they were perceived as very highly skilled and were valued. So there's records of, for instance, them valuing artists coming from the Guangzhou area and having them come to Beijing and work on the imperial painted enamels there. So I think that their skills were recognized. I don't think they were perceived maybe in the same way as we look at artists today. But I think they were certainly valued, and I think I think the skill was recognized as being excellent. So.
I was curious because you were talking about all of these chemicals they're working with, arsenic, mercury, etc. Is there something known, or maybe even just from the French enamelers, of that these, if you were an enameler, you are known to be exposed to so many health hazards, and it's this must have been very different from being the potter, or if there's anything known about that.
For instance, there was the gilding. A really good example of that is mercury gilding, which was an extremely toxic process, and they were aware of that quite early, actually. Relatively speaking, I guess. By the 1850s, for instance, in France, it was already something where I think they were banning it. They were trying to prevent people from doing it, because if you were basically a gilder, that was your specialty. If you were a mercury gilder, your life expectancy was about 35 years. So, because, it's very toxic. And so, that was very early recognized that there was that connection. With the enameler or glass workshops, I'm not completely sure. I think it depended a little bit. I think maybe because they were mixing stuff into molten glass, so it wasn't maybe as much particulate, or it wasn't with the mercury. The problem was the vapor, because you're having to heat the surface and then you're getting mercury vapor, and so it's a very, very direct way to poison yourself, basically. So,
All right, thank you very much for your wonderful presentations and the wonderful questions. And then now we have time for tea and coffee, and we have to be back here at 12 for the next panel.